back to this mess we have here. Back on the harness. It occurs to me as I sit here, the weather is getting a little bit warmer, it's getting a little bit nicer, but we realized that I can't really do too much more to get the Chevelle running until I get some of the wiring set up. Doesn't matter how bolted together I get the motor. Once I get inside, I still have to get this thing running. And to do that, I've got to have the wiring set up. So it's about time that I set about making sure that I get this wiring harness in good nick. This is one of those scenarios though, where it's not all about elbow grease. There's actually a bunch that's gone on behind the scenes, some elbow grease and research and frustrating nights to try to figure out how to get this to work. And it's all come down to working on this wiring schematics. Now I do have to start with this. This is the basic wiring schematic for a 1970 Chevelle for the front section. So this is the engine wiring harness and the lighting harness, which is what we took out of this thing. That's sort of the standard affair. The trick is with this though, that there are things in here that I don't want. So there's an externally regulated alternator. I don't have that. I have an internally regulated alternator. That means that there are wires in here that I am not going to use. Routing that's not applicable to me. There's also elements in here that I don't have. There's a TCS relay in this that I do not have. That's going away. So the idle stop, not something that's in this car, that's going away. So there are elements to this wiring diagram that are not going to carry over to what I'm doing in this harness. So what I had to do was spend some time with that wiring diagram. And fortunately, I have a little electronic notebook that reads PDFs. So I was able to make this. If you guys actually want it, I'll post it. I wouldn't recommend that you guys use this as your own guide. But if you want to use it as a reference to sort of make up your own stuff, cool. I don't even know that this is right. There's a strong chance that I'm going to find out that there's stuff that's wrong in here and correct it as I go. So fair warning, what we're seeing now, you know, future Tom may look at this and go, what an idiot. No, that's incorrect. But for right now, I think I have a lot of this straight. So the pink stuff and the blue stuff that I have on this sheet is the new wiring harnesses that I'm making up. The black stuff is the stuff that's pretty much pre-existing. So that's giving me sort of the mapping to what I'm going to do here. There's two reasons that I did it. And I realize I'm talking a lot here. But there's two reasons that I did it, and this is good groundwork. One is that I've got a bunch of wire over here, and I want to make sure that I map this out right so I know what wire I'm grabbing so that I can tell myself what I'm doing here. So as I go through this and replace these wires sort of one by one and make these things up, I've got to make sure that I have everything mapped. The second reason is that I was not able to get all the exact same color wires that's marked out on the GM diagram. So that means that what I put in the car is not going to one-for-one match what's in the GM diagram. And so for that reason, I want to make sure that I have a physical record of what I'm putting into the car now, so that both for myself later, because future Tom, I guarantee you, is going to be forgetful, and also for anyone else who might own this car in the future, including Declan maybe someday, I want to make sure that there's a reference that they can go to sort of say, okay, some jackass rewired this car. These are not the right color wires. I want them to at least have this reference material so that they can say, all right, at least the bozo kept a breadcrumb trail of what the purple wire was supposed to go to when it's supposed to be a blue wire. So that's the idea. That's why I did this. This is a lot of work. At least it was for me, because I'm no pro with the electrical wiring. So that took me a while, and it took me a while to find the time to focus on things. So let's get into what we're going to do here now. So I'm starting off with the simpler harness first. The simpler harness, believe it or not, is actually the engine harness. So this is the smaller harness, less wires coming out of it. And what we're going to do here is I'm going to, I think, make my wires first. So the idea here, I'm going to try to show you through this camera. Hopefully you guys can see that. there are these little spade connectors. They actually call them Packard connectors that are inside this terminal lock. That's the terminating end of all of the cables that are in this harness. Every other connector on the other end is different, depending upon what it's going into. I think at least one of these wires, this one for the TCS relay, is going to go bye-bye. We're not going to use that anymore, so that one's going to come off and get removed. But most of the rest of these are actually going to get replaced by something. So if I look at a wire like this one, this purple wire, it's the starter wire. There's a big, ugly butt connector there with exposed wiring. I don't even want to know what's underneath this electrical tape, but I got to find out just because, you know, curiosity is going to get the better of me. But I guarantee it's not good. This is like a pet peeve of mine. It's one thing to, you know, sort of jury rig a connection and rig something up together when it's sort of a lower voltage line, something, you know, in the 20 gauge family. But when you're running juice through like a 12 or a 14 gauge line, let's not do things in an ugly manner, in an unsafe manner. It just seems like you could burn the car down. Yeah, this tape is 1,000 years old. My guess is it's covering up a pretty gross, oh yeah, that's just classic. People kill me. Now, I will admit that when I was 16 and 17, if I wasn't being properly supervised, this is the kind of nonsense that I would pull. I don't know if maybe you can see it better there. But as a grown man now, no. Don't be this guy. Don't do this. Doing this and then wrapping in electrical tape, that is not a sufficient wiring connection. Now, I don't want to get too quickly ahead of myself in disconnecting this whole cable. So this whole cable here still gives me roughly, as far as I know, the right length that I need, because it worked inside the car, to reach from, in this case, the firewall all the way to my starter. So I still want this wire, and I see where it's connected in here. And we're going to just sort of document this purple wire coming in here. Yeah. So the way you get these out, these little spade connectors, I don't know if you can actually, let's do this. Give you some white paper to focus on. These little connectors have a splice in them, a little slot through them. So they want to spring out and lock themselves in place. So what you do is just sort of squeeze that and push it back through the other way when you got to remove it on the other side. So now what we'll do is we'll take this over to the wire reel, the spool. We'll roll off about that much wire, cut it, and get back to business here. All right, so this is the handy dandy reel O wire. This is our 14 gauge wire. And this is the purple. This is the best I got for purple. So it's a little on the light side, but it'll work. It's technically purple, maybe more of a lilac, but it'll get us covered. And what I want to do here is just make sure I get about the right amount. And we'll overshoot this by a little, just to make sure we get proper coverage. A little snipper. Right there, and we're good. All right, so we've got our purple cable. So we've got two ends to this cable here. Let's get our tracking shit off here. We've got two ends to this cable. I think what we're going to focus on here is this end. We'll focus on that spade connection end first. And what we've got here is these Packard connectors. Definitely going to need glasses. Okay, so I've got a few different sizes of these connectors. I've got an 18 gauge, a 16 to 14 gauge, and then I think this is my 12 gauge. So this is the 14 gauge wire, I think, right? Nope, this is the 12. So I need 12 gauge crimpers. So we use our handy dandy strippers. Just about perfect. I'm going to start these . All right, so we crimped one end on there with our little crimper tool. We did forget to put a shrink wrap on one end, so we'll just slide it to the other end. Fortunately, that's not going to screw us up. All right, you guys have seen this before, little handy dandy torture-rooney. A little easier than breaking out the heat gun. Just like that, this business end is covered. Now I could, at this point, just go ahead and put the other end on here, which is an eyelet. I'm not going to. What I am going to do is throw the heat shrink wrap on there so that I don't forget it. And we will definitely want that on here. And we're going to leave it just like that. I'll probably throw a little knot in the end here. And the reason that we're going to leave it like that for now is I want to wait until we get this thing laid out, at least, maybe even until the engine is in the car, until I can make sure that this is the right length. There's still a possibility that I need to cut this down a little bit. So if that happens, I'd rather not waste a connector on it. So we'll hold that one off. In the meantime, let's take a look at this connector. It looks pretty clean in there. You can see, if you look inside here, it's pretty gunged up in there. That's not dirt. I mean, there is some dirt in there, but that's really not what you're seeing, all that black stuff. It's actually like an RTV. It's sort of a grease or a paste that was put in there at the factory when these things were made in order to get these connections sort of weather tight. And it is going to be important for us to replace that somehow. We're going to use sort of an RTV sealant relatively sparingly, just to make sure that we can get everything to seat in there and stay where it's supposed to go, and not have weather take its toll on these connections. Sort of the last thing you want, right, is to spend all this time doing this and then have water or moisture work its way in here and wreak havoc on you because you won't necessarily know. Okay. Let's see, the next things on the list here. TCS relay. Yeah, TCS relay, it goes bye-bye. So we're gonna just take that one right out. cord goes away. Something refreshing about that. The next several boring minutes were really just about me identifying the wires again that were in this harness and then plucking them out one by one. Just trying to make sure that I pulled all the wires in the right order, got everything identified, ditched the ones that I didn't need anymore, and kept the ones that I still needed. All this to move on to the next step, making new wires. So I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do yet, but I got to do something to get this crud out of these holes, especially in the ones that were left vacant and didn't have any electronics in them. The sort of obsessive tendencies in me really want to get those cleaned out, even though I guess I don't need to if they're not going to have electronics in them. But I'd like to start clean here. Oh, that came out in one big chunk. What are the odds? Can I get the rest to do that? Probably not. Initially, I thought I was going to have to soak these little bulkhead connectors in some sort of solvent to be able to get this RTV off, but in truth, this stuff was sort of dried out and old, so all I really had to do was just pick at it. Once I got at it with the little pick set and just sort of took my time, took some patience, and settled down and picked these out, they actually came really clean. Then I just had to spray them off with a little brake clean and wipe them down, and they were good to go. So this was a lot easier than I feared it was going to be. All right, that is about as clean as I care to get this. I can see through all the holes. There's no real residue left in this thing. It's pretty good. The next step was just a repeated process of me trimming wires to length, adding connectors, and then shipping them off down the line, rolling them up and putting them up on the shelf. There were a couple pieces where I did have to replace brand new connectors and a couple of spots where I saved the plastic harness from the connector and just replaced the brass connectors inside themselves. That way I'm ensuring that I can still make these connections as standard with the receivers that are already there for the car, but I've got new electrical connections instead. There we have it. This is nice and clean now. Sorry, a lot of this happened sort of off camera, but we got some clean ends here. New inserts inside. All good to go, nice and clean. And we got our, got our heat shrinks on. Everything's pretty stable. I think we've got our links right. We're pretty good. That leaves us down to one last cable on this guy to take off. If you're wondering why I'm not putting these all back in here as I go, it's a good question. I do have a schematic and a map that's sort of telling me where these are all going to go when done, so I'm not worried about putting them back in the right spots because of that map, and that's part of the reason why I made that map. Again, we're not looking for a perfect points score at Pebble Beach here. We're looking to get good. So with that, I'm going to take all my newly made wires and we're going to reassemble this guy. So we're starting with a diagram. Looks just like this guy. And the way that this diagram is written, this is the way we want to look at it. So if we look in that bottom right hand corner, this guy right here, this first one that we want to look at, we're looking for that 12 gauge purple. This is that big boy that is going to be running to our starter. This guy. So we're going to take this, make sure we double check our location. Yep. We're going to run him right in here. One thing I noticed about these bulkhead connectors is the fairly tight fit for the actual Packard connector on the wire side inside of these connectors. There's just not a lot of room. So when you're going for the Packard connector that's for the larger sized wire, it's a really tight fit for it to fit in. What I found once I started inserting these things was that I really had to trim that heat shrink that I put on there back off in order to be able to get it to fit inside. So that's what you're kind of seeing. That's what. Well guys, here we are, another day, another dollar, another wiring harness. So we've already got this one. This is pretty well set. Happy with our results here. We've got only a couple of connectors on here, but that's okay because the rest of the connectors, that's the easy stuff. And we'll get that stuff on once we've got the motor in place and we know where all these connectors go. We just don't want to shortchange ourselves. But that was the easy one. You remember me saying that last time. That's the engine wiring harness. So most of the connectors and most of the wires that are running to that are about keeping the engine running. This next piece is the lighting harness. So this is bigger. This is a bigger chunk of wires. There's more wires coming off of this. More shenanigans going on here, and it's not that none of these have anything to do with the engine. Some of them do, but they call it the wiring harness. So if you were to go and buy this, this is actually the more expensive harness that you're going to buy. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to go through this wire by wire and just replace them piece by piece. This is leading to the plug that went to the driver's side low beam connector. Look at how gross that is, huh? Well, the good news is that I bought a new one of those. So I do have a new connector for this. So what we're gonna do is we're just going to take note of these connectors, where this is mounted in here. We'll pull this connector out, and then we're just going to make our new connections. All right, I was not anticipating that. I went to go unravel this thing and it was about 900 feet long. That wire actually teams up and heads over to the passenger side low beam from the driver's side low beam. So it's quite long and that piece of the wire was still taped up. So we're gonna go in here and just like we did on some of those other wires yesterday, we're going to go in and back out this connector. All right, so again, just like we did yesterday, we just stuck a screwdriver in to depress this little barb. She came right out. We are not reusing that low beam connector. We purchased some low beam connectors. Now these ones you'll notice already come with the pigtails and the connectors in them. First of all, these connectors are not what I need. Secondly, I'm not really into splicing. The whole idea of this is getting these things as clean as possible. So we're not going to use those. So we're going to just back these things right out and pitch them. Is we've got to make the connector that goes into the driver's side low beam connector. That's this little guy. Now, in this case, it's two wires that are going into one because this is where they're going to split off and head over to the passenger side. So we're going to strip back the wires on both ends, or one end of both of the cables. So to do that, I'm going to use these guys. These are the wire strippers. I really like these things. I got them from Amazon. I put them in a link several videos ago when we were doing stuff on the Chevelle. So if you're curious about them, you can go back and check out there. But basically, you just slide the wire in. And then it strips off a perfect little amount. And it works on multiple gauges of wires. Gives you exactly what you need. Makes things a lot easier. And we are just going to place that inside the wiring connector. And then I'm just going to use these needle nose pliers just to get our first connections made. That's just to hold it in place. That's not a firm connection. I'm going to go back to these and throw this in here to make our final connections. That's really what's cinching us down. Yeah, that's good and tight. And I am, of course, back to forgetting to put the heat shrink on. But fortunately, we've got both ends available here. We'll go back to our little butane torch. I actually want to put this down a little bit. There we go. And again, we use this shrink wrap just because it's going to give a little bit more strength to this connection. A little bit more weatherproofing, not a lot, but a little bit more physical strength, a little bit more reinforcement. I will just feel better about it and do whatever I can. Chaos. So this green wire, and this is the chaos that comes along with, by the way, the idea of the lighting harness. Because the lights are tied together and sequenced a lot of times, you end up having these sort of octopuses of lights because they're tied in with each other. So this green wire is the one wire coming off the fuse block or off the bulkhead. And then it is going into a four-way connection. So from the block, it goes into this four-way. One of those ways goes off into this spade connector, which I think is now pulled out of one of these clips. The other two, one goes off into one of the high beams. The other one goes off, tracing into the other high beam. Where does that last one go off into? I vaguely remember this from having dealt with it before when wiring this up. So one of these, it goes into the low beam, and then that bridges across to a high beam. Yep, that's that. And the other one just goes to the low beam, and this one is supposed to go to the low beam as well. Whew. Yowza. All right, we're gonna need a lot of green cable for this one, a lot of 16 gauge green wire for this one. I think I may just take that off the spool. All right, what I'm actually gonna do is make that butt connection with one of these. So this is a heat shrink joint. I actually really like those a lot. They have a solder on the inside of them. So when you use heat to shrink them down, not only does it heat shrink around the cable itself to try to make that sort of watertight, but the solder actually melts inside of it. So you actually get a good soldered connection. They work really, really well. That on the best we can. We've bundled the wires inside of there. Now we're going to take our little torcheroonie and get this melting. You should see the plastic around it melt a lot quicker than the solder. Unfortunately, I'm at a bit of a dead end now. A little stuck. So we'll have to hold this and pause it for another night. Hopefully that's going to be real soon. But I feel like we got some real progress. I got most of our wires done. We do have one full wiring harness set for, at least for the engine harness. And now I'm really just wrapping up one wiring harness set left now for the lighting harness. And it's really just those side marker lamps. We just got to wrap those pieces up. And really, I just got to locate those side marker lamp assemblies. And once I can get those, I can bang this out, which I will probably end up doing just off camera if I can get it done. And hopefully I can just show you this whole thing all wrapped up. All right, it's a fresh day and I'm back at it again and back down to the wiring. And when I left you last, we were talking about these guys. These are the marker lamps that are designed to go into the, I think these ones go into the fender wall, or they might go into the front markers. I can't remember which one. Either way, it doesn't really matter. They both use sort of the same attachment and will pose me kind of the same issue. Now, the challenge that I'm having with this is that I would like to replace this because this wire is just dead old. This is all crusty and pretty tired. I wouldn't mind replacing this grommet at the same time. These wires just feed through it. But these wires then feed through this grommet. So there's a little bit of a trick with this. So I thought I would be able to find this piece online as an assembly, this piece and the grommet and all pre-wired. I can't. So what I can find is this piece with just some wire strands coming off of it. So as a result, what I am going to do is I'm just going to redo and replace all the wires basically up to right before here. So we'll get this whole thing set up so that I can, when I get this new piece in, just attach it and clip it in. So we'll just run it that way. So makes it a little bit easier for me on my end. I can continue on with this and get this thing finished up. So after a lot of trial and error and a lot of mess, because you guys already know I don't work clean, I think we finally have ourselves an answer. I managed to get the wiring harnesses together and into the car. They're just roughly placed in there right now. This is not the finished location, but let me show you what I got. So our harness is connected in there. This is not finished yet. So we're gonna wait until we really test everything and make sure that everything is functioning as expected. But then once it is, we're gonna go ahead and use some RTV on all those wires up at the bulkhead connector, just like they would have at the factory, just to make sure that everything stays weather tight. But here's where that routing is. All these wires all just sort of loosely bundled together now. We'll zoom out a little bit for you. And there we have it, all laid out roughly in the vehicle. So this is a lot of wiring, but you know, it's an older car, so it's not as much wiring as it could be. And there's still a couple of pieces that I have to get going on here. Couple of pieces I have to replace. One thing, for example, every one of these headlight switches, I did not have the right spade connector. This is a 1/4 inch spade connector. I need a 3/8 spade connector. Didn't have them. And wasn't able to secure the right type of connector at any local stores. You need the connector that has the little tab on the back side of it so that it stays inside of these sockets. So I'll be ordering those online. Not really a big deal though, because as you can see here, there's a lot of extra wire. I ran, when in doubt, ran a bunch of extra wire. So there is no doubt in my mind at all that what's going to end up happening here once we get everything installed is that I'm going to have to make some final adjustments and some final connections. I'll probably have to redo a bunch of these connections at the ends to shorten them up, just to make sure that we don't have a ton of extra wiring hanging around. But this is a big load off. Kind of huge in my book. It's a real weight off my shoulders to get this done. So overall, guys, I'd say far from a simple job. It wasn't really simple at all. There was a lot of pre-work that went in here with the schematic and me making sure that I had it mapped out correctly and that everything was ticked and tied off properly. There was a lot of double checking of that work. There was a lot of planning on the wiring side to make sure that I had either the right colors matched up so I was as close to the original schematic as I could be, or a lot of planning to try to get something as close as I could get and then mark that down in the schematic so that I know that in my new schematic I'm properly representing that wire. Then there were a lot of changes. There were a lot of pieces that were in the original schematic and that would have been on the car originally that are not here now that I had to remove because I just don't want redundant pieces in there. And there are things that I had to change and add in. It went from an externally regulated alternator to an internally regulated alternator. That's some wiring changes that I had to make sure I had accommodated for. It's gone from a coil ignition to an HEI ignition. I had to change for that too. That meant changing the gauge of that coil wire, making sure that that's a heavier gauge wire that can handle the HEI. So there was a bunch of things like that that had to go into the planning part of this, and then I had to follow through and execute according to the plan. But overall, not a hard job, just a kind of tedious one. But at the end of the day, I'm gauging that this job saved me somewhere in the neighborhood of about $400. Because otherwise, this thing would have cost $500 to get both of the wiring harnesses brand new. And the reality is, even if I did that, those wiring harnesses would not have been right. I still would have had to modify those wiring harnesses because they would have had things in there that this car doesn't have, or that would have had to modify things based on this car's layout. And finally, I know this wiring schematic now much better than I did before. And that's a big key that I'm going to pass on to you guys when you're talking about these project cars and you're thinking about activities like this and wondering whether or not you should do it yourself. Doing work like this, if you've got the time to do it, gets you to know your car infinitely better. People ask me all the time, not you guys, but people that I know and people that I meet who aren't car people ask me all the time, where did you learn how to do all this stuff? And the simple answer is from doing it. Doing it wrong, studying how to do it right and trying to do it right, still doing it wrong, and then fixing it. It's doing it. And this is one of the ways you can do it. If I had gotten this harness online and spent the money, would this have gone quicker? Yes. But I would not have understood the schematic any better than I did before I started this project. And so when things went haywire, when we put the engine in, I would not have known what's going on. I will have a much better idea as to what might be going wrong now if anything doesn't go according to plan once we get this whole thing hooked up. So overall, something that I would absolutely recommend doing. You should put in a new wiring harness if you're dealing with a car that's this old and you're changing things out. Absolutely recommended. And if you've got the time to do it and just a little bit of aptitude, make your wiring harness for yourself.